It's Friday, November 5th, 2021. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the two-party Georgia Oral History Project sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Athens with Jim Langford. Jim is a proud graduate of the University of Georgia's Grady School of Journalism and the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences. He's also a graduate of the Harvard Business School. Jim co-founded and led product development and marketing for the Harbinger Corporation, a pioneering e-commerce software and networking company. He was later principal at Langford and Associates. Jim has also pursued an extensive career in the nonprofit sector, including stints as Georgia State Director for the Trust for Public Land, project manager for the Jekyll Island Revitalization Project, founder and president of the Million Mile Greenway, and executive director of the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty. He's currently president of the Kusawati Foundation, as well as president and executive director of the Georgia Prevention Project. 5 Georgia governors have appointed him to a host of boards and commissions, including the Georgia Humanities Council. A trained archaeologist, Jim is past president of the Society for Georgia Archaeology and the Georgia Council of Professional Archaeologists. I'm sure there's something I'm leaving out, but Jim, thank you for spending your Guy Fawkes Day morning. I think we've discovered somebody who's been able to squeeze more than 24 hours out of a day in you.
Well, I'm not sure I believe in reincarnation, so I decided I've got to do it all in one lifetime.
Very clear, very clear.
In parallel mode instead of sequential mode.
Right.
Right.
So let's start. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and background growing up in Northwest Georgia.
Well, Calhoun, when I was growing up, was a very small town, probably less than 1,500 people. Now it's maybe 15,000, so it's grown dramatically.
No Buc-ee's back then.
No Buc-ee's back then. And, no I-75,
right.
US 41, that kind of thing. And of course, everybody from Ohio and the great Midwest were running through Calhoun to get to Florida, down US 41. And Calhoun was a small town known for agriculture and also the carpet industry, although before that it was the chenille and
the
rug industry. And so they had the chenille rugs hanging out on the lines, and little roadside stands selling peaches and pecans and chenille bedspreads.
Right.
And that led into the carpet industry. We're not here to talk about that today. But that's but that was Calhoun growing up, and my grandfather was president of the bank in Calhoun.
This was Otto Langford.
That's right, Otto Charles O.C. He didn't want people to know his real name was Otto Charlevon Langford. So he told people it was O.C. or Charles was his middle name, which is not true. And so he was the oldest of 7 or 8 children. I'll have to count them up, but his father died his father was a country doctor who died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918.
1918, yeah.
And so
sadly relevant again.
Yes, and they lived out in the country, we would say, in the little community of Redbud, and that little house still stands, and where that was. And so he came to town, moved to town, went to Reinhardt College, graduated from there about 1920 or so, and then was in Calhoun and one of his first jobs was actually he was clerk of court and was elected to that position a couple of times. And I've actually found recently his certificate that gave him permission to practice law. So it's his law practicing certificate, but it's signed by him because as clerk of court, it said that he was able to do that, as regards the Superior Court, because he was, clerk of Superior Court, and he then was able, under such and such judge's jurisdiction, was able to then practice law, and awarded himself that, I think, about 1930 or I forgot what it is, 1929 or
Sure.
But anyway, so my father graduated from the University of Georgia, practiced law in Calhoun, was, had his office in the second floor of the building where my grandfather was president of the bank on the first floor. My father's office was on the second floor of the bank building, and all this was right across the street from the courtborn.
Classic small town.
Classic small
politics.
Town. Yeah, exactly. And so I was born in 1953, another block or two away from my father's office in a little building that was called the Johnston Hall Clinic. and it was on Wall Street. So when I was at Harvard Business School, I was able to tell all my friends I was born on Wall Street. Of course, that was South Wall Street in Calhoun, Georgia, and that little brick building still stands today. And so, small town with all the things that happen in small towns, and fishing in the country, and doing all that stuff growing up. But political stuff and public service work was always there. It was always in the background, and it was always a kind of a drumbeat for my grandfather, being clerk of court, but he also felt this great sense of responsibility to help out, particularly the poorer farmers who were from that little community where he grew up, and help them out. And I've found some interesting documents that show how he did that in a lot of ways. And then my father very quickly picked up the same kind of ideas about public service, and was elected as a solicitor in town, and that kind of thing. Was later on the school board, and was in the state senate and the state house of representatives and all those things for many years. My mother, interestingly, was perhaps better known for her public service in Calhoun. She came to Calhoun from Oklahoma, Midwest, and with this great sense of community spirit,
and she was a PE teacher.
A lot of
trained.
energy. She was a PE teacher, so her degree was in physical education, and so from the Oklahoma College for Women, Chickasha, Oklahoma, and
that booming metropolis. Of
exactly.
Chickasha,
How they met, how my mother and father met, was through a first cousin of mine from Adairsville, Georgia, who had moved to Chickasha, Oklahoma, and knew my mother from camp and other things growing up, and my father was visiting during World War II, right after World War II, and met my mother.
Okay.
So that's how they met. So my mother came to Calhoun, Georgia, rural Georgia, in 1945 or 6, right after the war. She taught high school and taught PE. She was a substitute teacher, did a lot of different things. But she was a Red Cross volunteer. And so blood drives were a big deal, for her. And I still remember showing up at the blood drives and, watching the people laying on the tables and giving the blood and doing all that stuff as a kid. But as part of that, she decided to create a swimming program to teach kids how to swim. And in rural Georgia, kids were dying, falling in ponds and rivers and stuff.
Sure.
And so she took that up as an important, what she thought was an important activity. She then taught swimming for 30 years with a big program of other volunteers, women in the community, other people who were helping her teach kids. And she taught thousands of kids through that program. And they named a big swimming complex for her in the 1970s when they created that. But she was also creating recreation facilities. So she was instrumental in getting funding from the Appalachian Regional Commission.
Sure.
And other groups like that to get funding for recreational facilities, swimming facilities, ball facilities, parks, all that kind of thing.
Right.
And so growing up, we had 2 telephones, and this is before anybody had any, even push button phones. And there were 2 physical phones in the house for 2 different lines. And both lines would start ringing about 7 o'clock in the morning and would stop around midnight.
Oh.
And she was a character who only slept about 3 hours a night for 40 or 50 years. That was just her way. So, so sometimes that was very frustrating, for us as kids, and drove us all nuts and around. And it got a little, manic around the holidays. She'd stay awake for 3 or 4 days straight. Sometimes getting stuff done, and it was. You can imagine
where you get your work ethic.
Well,
from.
that's certainly that. There was no laying in bed. You just didn't have time to do that. It also was my impetus for getting out of high school early and getting out of the house, and I did, and came to the University of Georgia when I was 17 as a result of that. But anyway, but the public service angle of hard work, doing things on behalf of the community, total volunteer, doing that stuff as a sense of duty, but it was also a sense of accomplishment, that you're accomplishing real things, for people in communities. And where the people in the local community might not even appreciate what those things were all about at the time, but they came to do that over time.
But describe your parents' politics for me, that sort of political
Sure.
milieu that you grew up in.
Well, essentially, my grandparents in Oklahoma were old Midwestern Republicans, the old style of Midwestern Republicans, which means they were actually more liberal in a lot of ways in those days than, say, Southern Democrats.
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so my mother brought some of those values to Calhoun, Georgia. She integrated the swimming pool in 1966. And she just said, "This is what we're going to do," and nobody argued with her. I mean, it just happened overnight, in a way. So she brought that kind of ethic to the table. My father was old school, Democrat Party in the old days, yellow dog Democrat might be a good way to describe it. But I think they were. My grandparents were also very progressive. I'm not sure if that's the correct term for these days, but it certainly, would be viewed in those days as people who had very reasonable views about things. They were not racist. They were very accepting of other people and other cultures, and were curious about other people and cultures, rather than being, in any way trying to keep those cultures down in some way. So that was good for me. It was a very healthy atmosphere for me. I had lots of African American kids every day that you're playing with and doing things with, and so when integration happened in 1966 or 7 in Calhoun, it really didn't. I didn't feel like it was a big deal. I mean, I just never, and I think that's a tribute to the people in Calhoun too, where if they had any kind of racist ideas about things, you just didn't see it. You just didn't see it in the street. At least I didn't see it.
Right.
I do remember one time seeing what I understood later was a Ku Klux Klan rally, and my father and I were driving to the country to go fishing on a Saturday, and we're driving by. We drive out of town, cross the river, and there was the dump. There was what we called the dump. That was the city landfill. And there were some cars over there, and there were some people doing some things. And I said, "Well, what's going on over there?" He said, "Oh, don't worry about that." Okay. So a few hours later, we're driving back to town, and we look over there, and gosh, there's some stuff burning over there, And I said, "What is that?" He said, "Those are crazy people. Those are some really nutty people." And he still didn't really tell me quite what it was. I think he may have said Ku Klux Klan. He may have said something like that. But I was never told those are terrible racist people who are doing terrible. They tried to minimize it, I think, rather than aggrandize it in some way. And so it took me a few years to kind of figure out what was going on with that.
Well, Northwest Georgia, I mean, stepping back a little bit, has a reputation politically.
Sure. It does now.
For being a hotbed of John Birch Society activity in the 50s and 60s, and then represented by Larry McDonald, who... Of
course, that was Cobb County, and we thought Cobb County was a little weird and a little different from Calhoun, from that area. So,
Yeah, right, the old 7th District,
Sure.
which has changed so much.
Of course.
So... Was your father aligned with any particular faction? Because this was one-party politics back when your father started in politics. Right. Was he aligned with any particular faction?
No, he maintained good personal relationships with lots of people, and so when politicians came to town, and I can name several who did, they looked for the young lawyer in town who was active in the community, with a young active wife in the community, and so my father was the lightning rod for that, and became the key person, the go-to person for those kind of campaigns. So I remember John Davis, who was the congressman.
John W. Davis.
John W. Davis in the 7th District. I remember him well. And then the first governor of Georgia that I remember coming to our house was Ernie Vandiver. Mm-hmm. And he came to our house because he was in town for the dedication, the opening of the new Echota Museum and State Historic Site. And so I remember that day very clearly, all the things that happened that day. And he brought his children over to our house. In fact, we went back early, and one of those daughters, Jane, has been a friend of mine ever since. And so we've been close friends since we were 9 or 10 years old as a result of that. Went to the Governor's Honors Program later together. Right. So I'm just saying that we had that kind of activity of these elected officials coming in through the House. Ernie Vandiver appointed my father then to the State Game and Fish Commission, which later became DNR
Right.
in the early 70s. This is how, in a way, then Carl Sanders. I think the first campaign that I can remember working on was Carl Sanders in 1962.
Right.
And I was 9 years old. And the one thing I remember is my mother had a big old Oldsmobile. And of course, in those days, it had a big front seat, big back seat, and we had about 6 kids in the car.
Oh,
Okay. And what we had was an assembly line in the car for taking the materials, a brochure, a button, a letter, whatever it was, and putting them in a little plastic bag. So one person would put one thing in, and they pass them all the way around to the last person in the car, would take it, open the door, and run that little bag to somebody's front porch. So that was door-to-door campaigning,
Right.
and using little kids to help make that happen. So I remember that very, very clearly. That was the first campaign I think I ever worked on. And then of course my parents would talk about the presidential campaign.
Sure.
And I'd follow those as well. So when 1966 rolled around, of course Georgia governors could not succeed themselves in those days. So yes, we were Carl Sanders fans and friends. And my father had been reappointed probably by Carl to the State Game and Fish Commission at some point. And so, but my father got phone calls from some other key friends of his from law school. And one was Bill Gunter from Gainesville, who was a well-known lawyer in Atlanta, who was one of his law school friends. Charlie Curbo was a
Sure.
friend as well. David Gambrell was a younger, part of that group later. And so they called my father because they wanted his help in helping out this young guy from South Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who was going to be running for governor and had been in the state Senate for a brief period of time at that point. And so my father went, sure, sounds great, and count me in. And the next thing you know, every Sunday we were driving to Atlanta down old US 41 to get to Atlanta and go to the Dinkler Plaza Hotel.
Right.
Which was next to the Playboy Club, downtown Atlanta. So
I think it's the Marriott Marquis now. but
It
I
was
know
not. No, the Dinkler was over across from the movie theater that's still down there now. So it
Okay.
was
Yep.
behind the
I
Carnegie
gotcha.
Library. Okay, over in that way. On the way, if you were going to Riches, it was kind of right down in that
see.
little neighborhood. And so we would go there on Sundays. And after church, or maybe we skipped church those days, I don't remember. But we would get there, and the big attraction, one of the reasons for going there was to have a meeting of all the other people who were working in the campaign, strategists.
Right.
And so talk about things, talk about what was going on in the campaign. But then also to use what was called a Watts line, which was this mysterious, phone with the push buttons, and a Watts line meant wide area telephone service. That was the earliest days of toll-free calling. So you could get on that Watts line and you could call anybody in Georgia for free. And so that was a big attraction for my father because he would want to call all these people, that he was calling about the campaign. So that was what we did. And so, yes, got to know Jimmy Carter very well, and Rosalind and the boys, and Amy was not born until 1968.
Right.
And so the boys, Jeff was the youngest of the boys, and he and I were about the same age or a year apart. And I was 13, so he was 13, and we were doing crazy stuff all over that hotel. And, dropping cups of water down a stairwell to, 12 floors down.
As teenage boys.
As teenage boys are meant to do.
Yeah.
And so, but I would also then sit in these meetings and listen to Jimmy Carter. And from that early age, I understood this was somebody really important. This was somebody more than important. This was somebody who was saying important things. And
What do you mean?
well, talking about issues, or campaign things, and so as a 13-year-old, you're kind of looking at that, and you're going,
Sure.
seventh grader, going, gosh, what are these issues really all about? And this guy has a very interesting way of talking about those things in a way that a 13-year-old could understand.
Right.
Even. And it was a small group of people in the room. There might not be but 30 people, but 25, 30 people in the room. But having a way of describing those things, and mannerisms, that were very open and accelerate. It was a very accommodating way of speaking and integrating what he was saying into the conversation.
Uh-huh.
And so, that became then my moment that I began. He began to have a huge influence on my life, on public service, crafting that public service into policy, being able to get up and explain things to people in a group of people, and doing that in a very I want to call it non-political way, but certainly not some sort of dramatic, colorful way, but in a very logical kind of way,
Right.
describing these things. I was impressed by that. It meant a lot. It
Which
had an imprint on me.
very different style from Georgia politicians at the
Yeah,
time.
it was not a bombastic style. It was not a. Of course, I'd seen or heard Marvin Griffin or and some of these other characters who were around, and Carl Sanders was, of course, Mr. Buttoned Up, business kind of guy, too. But anyway, it was the first time I'd had a chance to really see somebody like that up close at a very formative age for me,
Right.
13 years old, and so that campaign became a big deal. Now my older sister then, Judy, was the same age. She was actually a year or two younger than Jimmy's oldest son, Jack,
Right.
and so they became an item a little bit. She was, I guess, 16. He was probably 17 or 18, starting as a freshman at the University at Georgia Tech at the time, or about to start at Georgia Tech. And so they became dating and became an item. But every Sunday we would come down and do these things with the campaign group. One of those Sundays we went to the first Atlanta Falcons game at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. And we've got tickets because Rankin Smith was on the State Game and Fish Commission with my father. And he, of course, was the owner of the team.
Right.
And my father used to tell the story that the first meeting after Rankin Smith bought the team, they had their first Game and Fish Committee meeting, and this other character who was on the commission was from down in coastal Georgia. I'll remember his name in a minute. And he looked at Rankin Smith and said, "Well, how do you do, Mr. $9 million?" Because that's what it cost to buy this team. "How do you do, Mr. $9 million? I've been sitting across this table from you for 5 years, and I didn't even know you had $1 million." And so my father loved telling that story. But it's also an artifact of a football team only costs $9 million.
Even adjusted for inflation, that's ridiculously low.
That's pretty insane. So anyway, so I just remember that as a detail of one of those Sundays. And the other funny detail about that game is that they played Philadelphia Eagles, by the way, is that here we were sitting in the stadium, and I looked across the field, and maybe it was because it was an exhibition game. It was first game, but it was an exhibition game. But all the players for both teams were on the same side of the field.
That's odd.
Yeah, it was very strange. So, and I started thinking, well, is this what happens in professional football? Is this just how it works? I had no idea. But anyway, so I'm digressing a little bit. But the point is, it was a formative time for me to get to know Atlanta, things outside of Calhoun. We came to Atlanta a lot as kids, but really starting to focus on things outside of the little town.
The way you describe Jimmy Carter is sort of a very calm, logical, analytical person.
Right.
Your father's political style was a bit more colorful and outgoing.
Later, it was. He was a colorful guy with lots of great storytelling. He loved joking and that kind of thing. Yes, and he was not, though, an elected official at that time.
That's right.
He had been a solicitor, some small town stuff. So
Right.
he was not known for his campaigning or campaign style. That came, later. After Jimmy Carter was elected, then of course in 1970, and then we spent a lot of time with the Carters between '66 and '70. After Jimmy lost that campaign at '66,
Because he never really stopped running for governor.
Right. And so they came back in '68, and I've found recent notes on that and pictures where they came. They were there in 1968 in our home, and Amy had been born, and so she was sitting in a high chair. They stayed overnight with us, and
Sure.
that kind of thing. And so, so then the campaign of 1970 came around. Now, in the meantime, my sister had graduated from the University of Georgia. Jack had been to Vietnam in the Navy. They got back together, and then they got married in the fall of '71. And so, right during Jimmy Carter's first year
Right.
in office, and that was in November of that year.
Were they married at the mansion?
They were not. They were married in Calhoun, Georgia, in the First Baptist Church in downtown Calhoun, and the reception was in Dalton because you really didn't have a place to have a reception in Calhoun. So you had to get the car, drive to Dalton, 20 minutes to the country club. So that's where we were. But we did have a couple of functions at the governor's mansion that I remember very well, and Graham Jackson played the piano.
Oh yeah.
Who was the African American guy who was famous for playing for 4 or 5 presidents, and so. He played at this reception. I'd say a reception. It was a little dinner. It was like a dinner, engagement dinner type thing at the governor's mansion in '71.
So 70, you started at the University of Georgia in 1970.
In '70, yes, fall of '70.
Did you work on the Carter campaign?
I did.
Which I guess the tough part of that campaign would have been the primary between Carl Sanders.
Yeah, and it was put me in a really
earlier.
interesting dilemma. In my summers of '67, '68, and '69, I went to boarding school at Westminster in Atlanta.
Okay.
When it was a boarding school, and so we would have 50 kids in the dorm and that kind of thing. Well, the second summer I was doing that to get out of the house in Calhoun and
get some peace and
get
quiet.
some peace and quiet, and even if I was having to work hard in school. But the second summer of that, my roommate was Carl Sanders Jr.
Chip.
No, Carl Jr.
Oh, Carl Jr. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and so that was Carl's only son. Of course, his daughter was Betty, who was a year or two older, and they both were at Westminster. And so Carl was my roommate. Well, it turned out to be a lot of fun. He was a character, and he was a high energy kid with an Atlanta kind of buckhead kind of way about him. And so, but
we'll let our listeners decide what that means.
Yeah, we'll decide what that means. But he was a lot of fun, and I took him to Calhoun for a trip or two, and then they took me to Sea Island for 4th of July, and that kind of thing. And I was 15, and his mother Betty gave me the keys to the car one day, which was their big Cadillac, and I was going, oh, what am I supposed to do? Well, I was supposed to run there, but it was only a learner's permit that I had, and I was going, oh my goodness. And so anyway, but that was quite a fun little trip. And the first time I ever had champagne, first time I ever had any alcoholic beverage, was with them on that weekend, and we had dinner with Charlie Davidson, who was also on the Game and Fish Commission with my father. And Charlie Davidson and Carl were big buddies, and their wives were big buddies, and they were all great friends. And we went to some big fancy, it was at the Cloister or somewhere at Sea Island, and so they were having champagne. And so I got a taste of champagne. I thought I was really in high cotton with that group. And that was the summer of '68 when somebody was poking Carl about running for vice president in the next election at some point. And so they were talking, somebody had some buttons at dinner at one, something about Carl being vice president. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And so in the campaign then, and I'll come back to '68 because there's another thing that happened that summer. Well, I'll tell it now, but that summer I was watching on TV the Democratic Convention, and there was Julian Bond, of course. Now there was all of that conflict going on within the Georgia delegation.
The Maddox delegation.
Right,
versus...
and it started with the Mississippi delegation, where they seated, part of the delegation not seated, or seated they were all white males.
Right.
And the Mississippi Freedom Caucus then said, wait a minute, we think we represent the Democratic Party. We have not been allowed to be delegates. And so that challenge happened, and Georgia had a similar kind of challenge, and so had some delegates who were seated. And so here was Julian Bond as a delegate, and he was, this bright, articulate guy, even-voiced kind of guy at the microphone. And I was watching all of that, and of course all the riots in the street and all that other stuff going on. But I was really glued to that campaign for some reason. I really found it very fascinating. And I think I said to my father, I said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be one of those delegates. in 1972? I was. And I was the guy at the microphone calling out all the votes for Georgia because I was secretary of the delegation.
Really?
Yeah. So, and I was the youngest delegate in the country that year that was elected.
So 72 would have been the McGovern.
The McGovern year, and I was not a McGovern delegate. I was an uncommitted delegate, which back in those days you had more uncommitted delegates.
Oh, sure,
than you had committed
sure.
delegates. And I certainly wasn't. And I didn't think much of McGovern, and I'll come back to that in terms of why. But my
I
politics.
think in retrospect, that was.
My politics. I mean, I was much more practical in my politics, and I saw the McGovern crew and all those people as being, much more microphone hungry and getting big. They wanted lots of publicity for their, for their issues, and rather than really focusing on implementation and practicalities. Now, I don't know where I got that from, but practicalities about politics to me was a big deal. Being able to get elected, and I knew McGovern wasn't going to get elected in Georgia for crying out loud. But I did. Georgia was only one of 2 states in those days that allowed 18-year-olds to vote. 18-year-olds couldn't vote until the amendment, whichever the number was.
26.
Something like that.
Yeah.
That came a few years afterwards that allowed 18-year-olds to vote. So I was a delegate Democratic, and I ran for that. I wasn't appointed. I ran for that in the congressional meetings that were held in Calhoun, but they had people being bussed in from a lot of different other communities for that election. And I got elected, and then once I got elected, I think Jimmy Carter and some others, Zell Miller was head of the party at the time, Charlie Curbo was one of the top people of the delegation, and Jimmy Carter. And I think they wanted a younger face because of all the things going on nationally to be as one of the officers of the delegation. So that made me secretary of the delegation. Or I don't know if I got elected, I can't remember. But anyway, that's how I ended up with all the, and the vote tallies, oh my gosh, that was the convention where we were meeting, from
You were up
till
all
dawn.
night, yeah.
Oh, all night long
Yeah.
with vote after vote after vote. I mean, of crazy stuff, seating of different delegations. The California Challenge was a big deal.
Right.
It was, it was winner take all primaries. It was when we were getting rid of those and moving to these other kind of primary systems. And so there were votes. And so I was truly running through the delegation all night long, getting vote tallies on different things, and then calling those votes out, and then moving it on through. Today, of course, they're all scripted delegation conventions, very tightly scripted, all on TV. But anyway, I'm off on a tangent.
Oh no! That was down in Miami Beach.
It was in Miami Beach. There'd been all the the terrible things that had happened in '68. They didn't want to have happen then, so they very tightly put all the delegates on buses.
Yep.
And took them through security that was barbed wire and you name it.
Because it was only the one bridge where you could go
right,
on
and they would let us into there, and the barbed wire and the I went out one day and watched and looked at these police guys. They were standing about 10 feet apart with nightsticks that were this long, that were more than a yard long, with dogs all the way around the thing, and that was inside the barbed wire. Of these barbed wire fences. So they meant business down there at that thing. And so anyway, so that was lots of details about that convention that were fun and interesting. And I was a Humphrey whip for Georgia.
Okay.
Because I really liked Hubert Humphrey. I had worked, see, I'm backtracking again. In 1971, I worked on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate for David Gambrell after Richard Russell died. By the way, I went to Richard Russell's funeral in Winder that year. I was thinking about that today as I was walking in this building. Jane Vander and I were friends, and I went up there, and and I had my little camera, and I was taking pictures of the of the funeral, of them coming in and out. But it was, that was another moment of interesting and important.
Humphrey was about one of the only who made it to the funeral because of the weather.
That's right. The weather was really.
I think most of the senators were grounded in Columbia or Charleston, something like that, weren't able to make it.
You got a better recall of that than I do, but that's absolutely. So that was that that thing. But let me back up. Let me back up to 1970, because 1970 was the Jimmy Carter election. So here I was, friends with the Sanders family, friends with the Carter family. I had to stick with the Carter folks, and so I felt a little bit bad about kind of abandoning my friend Carl Jr. in the Sanders family, but that's just the way it worked out. And so that campaign, I was much more involved in that. I was down there at that, the campaign headquarters that summer, working in Atlanta, I'd been to Governor's Honors Program that summer and had already been accepted to the University of Georgia, but I was down there working on the phones, stuffing envelopes, doing whatever it took. And Hamilton Jordan, of course, was running the campaign, and his wife Nancy, they were around, and so I got to know them really well. So there were a lot of things that happened in that campaign of '70 that were the real deal. I mean, this was a real campaign and a big campaign. And that thing between Carl and Jimmy Carter got a little ugly.
It was a tough campaign.
It got a little nasty, and they got to that runoff, and Carl said, "Okay, we're going to get tough now." And he took his cufflinks off and tried to roll up his sleeves, and we were all making fun of that. So the way he did that. But it was kind of a tough campaign, and that's too bad because Carl was not a bad guy. He'd done some great things for Georgia, and he'd become a wealthy Atlanta lawyer, of course, with a very successful firm that's still around and still successful today, and made a lot of money and did all that stuff because of his connections. Okay, so that's a little different from the peanut farmer from South Georgia, but that's what politics are all about. So that's what we kind of learned in that process. So that was 1970, and so here we go up into '71, and again I started with the Gambrell, the Gambrell folks. And David Gambrell, bright guy. And I learned a lot at the U.S. Senate, that year. And that was before they made really metal detector stuff and all that kind of thing. And so I had a little, a little card, ID card, that I was a staff member, U.S. Senate staff member with a picture on it. I figured out pretty quick I could go anywhere in Washington, any building I wanted to get into, just about anywhere, without an appointment, without anything. And that was fun because I'd run around the Smithsonian, and I ran all over the buildings, and I got to be a really good tour guide in the Capitol. And I went into every cubby hole in the U.S. Capitol, from the attic to the basement, and that was okay for a 18-year-old. That was a big deal.
So you started there in '71, so I guess Charles Campbell was still your boss at that point.
Charles was he at? Yes, I guess Charles was there.
Because he stayed on as AA.
That's right.
In the office.
That's right.
At least for a period of
Jim
time.
Pinnell was there.
Sure.
He was on the staff. A guy named David Dunning, who's still around in Washington. David was from. I was 18, and David was about 23, and I thought he was a big deal. 22 or 3. David and I were still close friends, and David worked in a lot of other campaigns, did a lot of other things. So yeah, there were a lot of people hanging around the office who were part of that group. And then of course, here we come, '72, and David Gambrell had to run for election because he was just filling this unexpired kind of term, and he had to run for election and got beat, by Sam Nunn. But I worked for David in that campaign, and I remember meeting Sam Nunn first time I met him, and it was at the Thomasville Rose Festival.
Right.
In April.
Big deal down
of
there.
That year, and my girlfriend was the Rose Queen from that year, from the year before. She was here at the University of Georgia too, and so I was down there, and we had this some little reception, and here was this guy, this eager young guy named Sam Nunn, and I had this great conversation with him, and he was recruiting. He was trying to recruit people like me, young people to kind of work for him in his campaign, and I went, well, I really like that guy. He's really a nice guy, but guys, I'm already on this other, I'm already kind of on this other campaign. And of course, I've had a lot of history with Sam, since those days. But anyway, but it was a fascinating and a wonderful experience for me to see the inside, look at Washington D.C. and again get some other mentors. Looking around and seeing Hubert Humphrey. That's where I got my idea about Hubert Humphrey being a wonderful guy. That guy introduced, I think, a piece of legislation every day for years. He had this reputation. You talk about a hard worker,
right?
And important legislation. First nuclear test ban treaty, on and on. A lot of poverty programs.
Humphrey Hawkins.
Yeah, all those things, And so that was impressive to me. But I also began to learn what statesmanship was all about. And you'd even hear Mike Mansfield was in the Senate at the time, and Barry Goldwater, and you'd hear, Barry Goldwater, who, we all thought was this, terrible guy who did all these crazy right-wing things in the '64 campaign and all that stuff, who said, I still can quote him on that, where he said, I don't care which side of the aisle people are from. What I constantly am remind myself of is that those people on the other side of the aisle love this country just as much as I do. And that's a valuable, kind of lesson to remember. I hope that's still true today, that people really do love the country more than they love themselves or love their campaign or love their fundraising. But, back then that was a value that I believed him when he said that.
Right.
And I believed there were people who had that kind of value system. So that was a valuable experience for me. Okay, so 72, there we go. We run through the national election scene, and that was a big deal. I got interviewed by a lot of radio stations and TV stations because I was this young delegate from Georgia, and they wanted to, I remember Steve Young from CBS Radio came all the way from New York to Calhoun, Georgia to interview me. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's that all about? But it was fun and it was interesting, and I felt like I was part of what was going on at the time.
Right.
And I got to make some speeches in Miami to some crowds, and that was it was all fun stuff. But there were student politic things going on at the time that were interesting, and I won't go through all the election things because they were dramatic, and there was money from outside. There was corporate money coming into student government elections, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff.
Student government, as in like Young Democrats of America, or
no.
UGA?
UGA. Oh, by the way, Young Democrats of America. That's an interesting thing that somebody asked Jimmy Carter about Young Democrats and having a Young Democrat organization in Georgia, and he said, "No, I don't believe in that." And I said, "Really?" And other people said, "Yeah, what is that all about?" He said, "Because young Democrats should be able to feel that they're part of the party too, and that there shouldn't be, a kids' table,
right?
Blah blah, and here's the adults' table, and I really liked that. Yeah, sure, okay. I was a secretary of the Georgia delegation. Oh, by the way, back in those days, when you had when you ran for president of the United States, what appeared on the ballot was the list of electors,
right?
And you voted for the slate of electors or for individual electors. Yep. Well, they put me on the ballot as one of the electors.
Yep.
So my first presidential campaign, I voted for myself, as one of the electors, which was kind of fun. I wish I had a copy of that old ballot.
Right.
I'm sure there's one in the archives.
I'm sure we've got one here somewhere.
I would love to see one.
We'll try and dig it out.
I remembered it at the time. It's the first national election that I ever voted in. I was voting for myself. But it was, okay, so I thought I was big cheese, and I was, again, 18, 19 years old.
Right.
But something else happened that was really formative for me and educational in so many ways. It's such a wonderful experience. There was something where it was an organization called the Student Advisory Council to the Board of Regents.
Okay.
And it was all of the schools in the university system, all of the presidents of their student bodies or their appointees. I think I was only one of two that was not a student body president. I was appointed to go and work with that group. And then I became chairman of that group twice. And so my job was to go to the regents' meetings. So I went to Board of Regents meetings, and we had all these fascinating issues that we got to the table on. And we ended up in the news. One of them is still timely. I'd still hear a little stuff about it once in a while now. And that is that the historically black colleges and universities in the university system, and that was Fort Valley State, Albany State, and Savannah State, that those three schools were getting underfunded for things like maintenance and overhead.
Sure.
So their maintenance and operations, and that the schools were not in good shape, physically. And so our student group, we went after that, and we researched it heavily and came back and said, yeah, that's right. Well, man, it made headlines and all kinds. And it pissed off it made angry very much the chancellor at the time, who was George Simpson. And Simpson was a notoriously tough guy. And he didn't like me showing up at the Board of Regents meeting. And he sure didn't like it that some of those regents were friends of my father's, were friends of my family's that Jimmy Carter had appointed. Philip Alston was one of those.
Right.
Who was just terrific and loved me. He was so good to me. And several others who were in the room. Of course, Roy Harris was on there too, the famous old segregationist from Augusta, and a lot of other characters. And so some of them kind of tolerated me, and then some of them really took me in. Charlie Harris was one of those too, from Ocilla, who was on the board.
Right.
Sam Way, who was one of the Carter folks from Hawkinsville, who's still alive today. And so they would help me out, on some of these projects. George Simpson did not like that. And one day he threw his cigar at me, which I'm proud of in a way. We were in this meeting, and after we'd come out with this thing about this, this thing with the colleges and the black colleges, then came this article in the paper that was talking about, the great system of the colleges and the universities and the university system and on and on. It was this glowing article. And so we all went, I bet he got that thing planted in there, blah, blah, blah. So I kind of said that in a meeting with him. He took his cigar, it was in his office, there weren't but about 2 or 3 people in the room. He threw a cigar at me across the table.
I assume he just chewed on a cigar. It wasn't
He
lit.
chewed it, right.
Okay.
And he would chew it and clamp down on it, and he just, he had this way, we'd get angrier and angrier. And he finally just threw it across the room. It's a lie, it's a goddamn lie, and he was slamming his fist down on the table and this whole thing. Well, I guess I know I got to him anyway. So, anyway, but that was 72, 73 kind of period and all that. So then we rolled on up into the 74 era. But Jimmy Carter then, as part of my conversations with him, my sister was living at the governor's mansion, and I'll never forget this. We went out one afternoon, and Jimmy Carter liked to throw the Frisbee, and it was the earliest days, I guess, of Frisbee golf.
Right.
And what he would do is he'd want to go to certain trees, name certain oak trees, and that's where. So I don't know what happened that day, or that afternoon, but Jack, my brother-in-law, was not there, and Jimmy wanted me to play with him. I said, okay. All right, so we go out and we're doing this Frisbee golf, and we're talking about some of these issues with the university system and what I was working on. And he said, I'm going to appoint you to this commission on public education in Georgia. I went, wow, and I was 19, I guess, and I said, okay, that's terrific. Well, what am I supposed to do? Well, you'll find out. It's all. Well, it became I found out there were these blue ribbon commissions on public education every 10 years. This was the second one that was then happened in that year of 73, 74. And it was called at that time, the Minimum Foundation Program for Education, MFPE.
Right.
Was the name of that group and that commission. So we had public hearings all over the state. And I was at the table with all those other characters, including, Jack Nix, who was head of the Department of Education, and Jimmy Carter, and lots of state leaders who were in the Senate and the House, and we had these deliberations across the board. And there was one moment where in some of what were our recommendations, I didn't like something that had to do with students and privacy issues. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I said I don't like that. I don't think I can go along with that. And so a couple of these legislators kind of got into this thing about it, tussle about it. And Jimmy Carter came to my defense, and he said, "Listen to what he has to say. I think this has value," and that meant a lot. It meant a lot to me. But anyway, so there you go. That was in 73, 74, and then came the campaign of Jimmy Carter's campaign of 75. I went to law school.
Right. You had graduated.
I graduated in 74, and then in the meantime, my father started running for office in 72. Jimmy Carter needed help in the state senate because Lester Maddox was the lieutenant governor, was running the state senate.
They did not like each other.
And they didn't like each other. They were on different pages, in terms of what they were trying to do. And so my father asked Jimmy Carter, what can I do to help you? Jimmy Carter said, go run for office, go run for the Senate. And so my father did. And so, in those days it was Gordon County and Pickens County and Cherokee County and Forsyth County. Those counties. They threw Forsyth County in there because nobody lived in Forsyth County. And so
things have changed.
Just threw it in Cherokee County. The whole county, you could, those 4 counties, oh my gosh, that's probably 2 or 3 senatorial districts now. But we started we wrote all the back roads. My mother, I found I still have all her files from those campaigns. And it was old index cards, and man, it was who lived on what road, on on what rural road, and what part of rural Cherokee County or Forsyth County or all those places. And so we went and did that, and I ended up on the radio, and and little church suppers and dinners and all of that, in those campaigns, which was fantastic. I mean, I'm glad I did that.
Right.
And it was terrific. And I learned something. I learned several things, but one of the things I learned that I'll never forget, and I've done it since then, not very often since then. But when you go to somebody's door and you knock on their door, well, they might come to the door, they might not. Back in those days, they did. They'd come to the door, and you realize that stepping across that, if they invited you in, and even if they didn't, that there was something about that threshold where you were really into their personal space, and that you needed to be respectful of that and appreciative that if they invited you in, and appreciative of the fact that you were in there to talk about something with them, what that meant, to enter into their lives for a moment. That was I don't know, for some reason it made a big impression on me that I remember from my later years working in campaigns. So anyway, I went to law school in the fall of '74, and I was sort of an ADD kind of kid anyway, and I was having trouble, concentrating. And I did kind of okay, but not really, not as well as I think I was expected to do. And then came and so Jimmy Carter's going to run for president, and I was having background conversations. Well, I left out the gubernatorial campaign of '74.
Burt
Lance from Calhoun, small town. He was president of the bank. My grandfather had been president of the bank before Burt.
Is it true he named one of his sons after your dad?
Yes, true. His son Beverly was named after my father. That's right. And so we were very tight. The family's very tight. LaBelle Lance, Bert's wife, was one of the swimming instructors with my mother. People thought LaBelle was some high society, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, she had that side of her, but she had a real practical, good side of getting out and doing things with kids, and she did that. And we went to camp with his kids, and we all went to camp together when we were younger. And so we were very tight. It was a very tight community, and we were very close friends. And my father was the lawyer for the bank and all that in that period. And
I'm sure that'll come up later.
That'll come up later. And my father was also the campaign chair for Bert's campaign for governor. And and so my father's office was across the street from the bank, and there was the bank, and the campaign headquarters was also a half a block away. So those kind of three little areas. A guy named Mike Jones was the key guy running the campaign. And Mike just died about a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he was a terrific guy and was very involved in political things. Well, I was one of only 2 or 3, field workers. So they would give me whole counties, areas of Georgia to go and make things happen. And I really enjoyed that. They gave me coastal Georgia, go down there to coastal Georgia, go to Savannah, and there are a whole bunch of rural counties down there.
Sure.
And here's a list of 4 or 5 names, and just go make it happen, And boy, talk about an entrepreneurial experience. And I did it right, but I did the same thing when I went to the Carter campaign. I'll come back and talk about that later. Here are 4 states and 4 phone numbers, go make it happen. No cell phones, nothing else, just go. And wow, and I did that at 22 years old, 22 years old. So here I was doing that around South Georgia, and oh my gosh, I really need to write all that stuff up, because there were some fabulous, crazy experiences down through there. And one was riding around with a guy who he and his brother owned and managed and operated and repaired all the slot machines that were, of course, illegal between Savannah and Waycross. And all the rural counties in between there. And it was just, oh my gosh. And so I'd ride around with that guy, and we were handing out brochures and going into the back rooms of these dinky little places down through there. Wow, I thought I knew a lot about Georgia until I got down.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking about all those slot machines in coastal Georgia.
Right.
Lester Maddox had a beef with those counties, with the clip joints and,
Sure.
and Long County and Liberty County.
Oh yeah, that's the counties I'm talking about. Long Liberty. I mean, you can name them all down through there.
Yeah, those big billboards. You know,
Yeah,
don't,
yeah.
Don't get caught in a clip joint.
Oh yeah, well that was all of that down through there, and it was a fascinating experience, truly fascinating, and I value it greatly for many reasons. And the first night I was down there doing that, my old roommate from Georgia, he was part of that student advisory council thing. He'd been head of the student government at Middle Georgia College, and he was terrific. His name was Ray Moses, and he was from Alston, Georgia, which is tiny, tiny little crossroads down there, and south of Vidalia and Lyons, right down in there. And so Ray and I were having dinner one night, and I said, well, I'm supposed to find this guy who's from Liberty County, and I'm supposed to go over there tomorrow. And so we come out in the parking lot. Well, there's a car with Burt Lance signs on the side of the car, and it says Liberty County on it. And I went, wow. Well, let's wait till that guy comes out. Next time, it was the guy. It was the guy I was supposed to find the next day. And I'll say his name was Harold Braun, B-R-A-U-N. Who is actually, you can find him on Google because he had a country hit record in the 1960s or 70s. And so he said, well, come with me right now. Well, this is 9 o'clock at night. Come with me right now. I'm going to go over to a little party and you can meet some local people over there. And Ray and I are both, 19, we're 20, 21 years old. Okay. We get in the car with the guy, and it was an El Camino in the back opening. We're all crammed in the front seat, and we go riding down the road, and we ride into this place, and here's this house. It's sort of a ranch-style house. There's a bunch of cars out front, but nobody that you could see anywhere. Okay, so we get out of the car, and we go in, and some guy's out there cooking on a grill, and we go in, and he's talking to the guy, yeah, go on back. We go back, go in this house. There's no furniture in the house. We go further back, and there are no people. So what's this all about? We get back to a back room, the door opens up, and here are about 10 guys sitting around a poker table with at least 3 or 4 guns on the table. I mean, pistols on the table. And he starts introducing me, and this guy, Harold, says, oh, yeah, this guy's working for Burt Lance campaign, blah, blah, blah. And starts introducing me. Well, here's the county commissioner and the sheriff and the blah, blah, blah. And all these guys who were elected officials in that county, and there they were sitting there at this big poker table with guns on the table. I went, oh my gosh. So I thought, man, I am in deep now. And so we go back out, we get back in the car, we get back to my car, and we agreed I'm gonna meet this guy the next day. And then he and I are gonna go off to some of these other counties. And Ray, we get in my car, and Ray's he's just quivering. You just have no idea. You have no idea who these people were. So the guy running the grill, that's the guy that got blown up in a car in a bomb about 5 or 6 years ago. It was the old Dixie Mafia thing they used to talk about down there. And he said, yeah, the only reason it didn't kill him was he had the car door open, so we went to the ignition, it blew him out the car door, and it messed him all up, but it didn't kill him. And I went, oh my gosh. And so that was the beginning of my experience in Southeast Georgia, in Southeast Georgia.
I'm sure you've read Melissa Fay Green's Praying for Sheetrock.
Yeah, and so a lot of that, kind of stuff down there. And of course, she's from Baxley, which one of my fraternity brothers was from Baxley.
Okay.
I know Baxley very well. So anyway, so there you go. That's the summer of '74. Burt Lance lost in that campaign to George Busby. I started helping George Busby out in some of his campaign stuff.
You weren't a Machine Gun Ronnie Thompson
No,
fan?
Machine Gun Ronnie, no. And George Busby, he didn't do anything much in the campaign, but he put these big billboards up that were red and white all over Georgia, and mostly South Georgia, that said, elect a workhorse, not a show horse.
Yep.
Bingo. Period. That's it. And he didn't do much else for many months.
Norman Underwood's Triumph of Advertising.
That's right. And Norman, by the way, is from Redbud, Georgia, with Cal, and so we talk about that often too. So I love Norman. Norman's a terrific guy who worked in Carl Sanders' firm, who was very close to Carl.
Oh yes, you're very close.
And so I still see Norman every once in a while. So there's the campaign of '74. Out of that campaign, I didn't know, but behind the scenes, I had kind of been making a reputation with some campaign people, including Hamilton Jordan, that, hey, that guy did a great job down there in Savannah or down there in southeast Georgia. And I did in Savannah. I organized lots of different things down there and had a great, experience down there. And so, and I was getting good at, I was kind of understanding how to do that, get a group of people together and how to organize them and who's going to do what and, and all that stuff. And so, so Hamilton was talking to me in 75, saying, early 75, okay, we're going to need help in this presidential, we're going to do this presidential campaign, we're going to do this run. And we're going to need help. Do you want to do that? Okay, well, that means me leaving law school. Well, okay, I'll do that. I'll take off from law school.
Motivation.
I need a break from law school anyway. And so we agreed that what I would do is take Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas.
Okay.
This was the first year of caucuses. Only the first year of the caucus campaign.
The McGovern Commission had gone into effect.
And so Iowa was going to be the first caucus. Mississippi was going to be the second one. So Iowa was going to be on a Tuesday, and Mississippi was going to be on that Saturday, 4 days later. So that became really important. Mississippi became really important for us in the campaign. Well, I think I was the third person hired in the campaign. They had somebody else in New Hampshire doing that work. They had somebody in Iowa, but I think I was the third person. Here, take these 4 states. And of course, you were looking at the calendar, seeing when those primaries were going to be, and said, okay, here are 4 phone numbers, go make it happen. Okay, so I got in the car with Frank Moore. Frank was later one of the top legislative aides in the White House. And Frank was terrific. Frank's still around, and I love Frank. And Frank and I drove. And this is in August of 1975. We drove from Atlanta to Jackson, Mississippi. Stayed overnight in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And a couple of very weird things happened within 24 hours. 3 really very strange things happened. And I became to understand, and my mother was, by this time, was starting to travel with Rosalind Carter and doing some things like that and doing a lot of work with her. And my mother had a way of doing remarkable coincidences that she just happened to be in the middle of, and that she would figure out how to take advantage of. And these things began to happen to me. We drove across the line in Mississippi, from Alabama to Mississippi, and immediately saw a helicopter flying over back and forth. What's that all about? Kind of low to the ground. Okay, well, we get to Mississippi, and the whole time I'm saying, well, these are people I'm going to talk to. There's a guy I met at the Democratic Convention in 1972, the 2 years before. His name was Danny Keys, and he was a young guy, and I've been in touch with him, and I need to look him up and find out what he's doing. I think he's running for office right now in Mississippi, and he's young. He's in his early 20s. Okay, we get to the state capitol, and we get out of the car, and something else happened. And we said, well, and there's this guy from Arkansas that we need to see, and his name's such and such Johnson. Okay, we thought about that. We get out of the car at the state capitol. There's the Johnson guy who was from Arkansas, and he was on the state capitol steps in Jackson, Mississippi. And and this is, again, pre-cell phone, pre-internet, and you just didn't have any way to communicate. Total chance. There's the guy we're gonna look for in Arkansas. We go in the door, and they say, oh, did you hear about the terrible plane crash last night? No. Danny Keys, the guy I was looking for, had been in a plane crash that night, the night before, running for office with a guy named Doxy Fisher, who was running for state treasurer. And they died in this crash, and that's what the helicopter was doing, was looking for the airplane. Third weird thing that happened, then 10 minutes later, we walked into the governor's office, whose name was Bill Waller. And big Bill Waller. And so we're going to go see Bill Waller. And we go up to the secretary, Bill Waller's secretary, and say, we're here representing Governor Carter from Georgia, who's now running for president. And we wanted to see if the governor was available. I mean, you just kind of walk in, And it was sleepy. There wasn't anything going on. There weren't any people around much. And she said, well, can I have your names? And I told her names. And she said, well, Mr. Langford, where are you from in Georgia? I said, well, I'm from Calhoun, Georgia. She took her glasses off and said, who's your father? I said, well, Beverly Langford. She put her glasses down, came around the corner. She took my hand in both of hers, and she said, I went to high school in Calhoun, Georgia. I went to high school with your uncle, your father, and on and on and on. Whatever you need. I'm here. Well, from then on, if I needed anything from the governor of Mississippi, I had a hotline to her. Her name was Betty Jean Lewis. She was also an aunt of Lewis Massey's.
Of course she was.
And her last name's Lewis. That's where Lewis got his first name. But anyway, isn't that bizarre? I mean, those are the. A fourth thing happened the next day, where I said, who we really need to find is the campaign manager for William Winter. He's the guy who's running right now. He's the guy who's the best candidate right now. He's got this other character running against him named Cliff Finch, who's just a scurrilous character, and we don't know who's going to win. But William Winter, we need to find William Winter's campaign manager. That's a great idea. Okay, that same morning, I go into a gas station, and I'm trying to pay for my gas, and here's this guy, and he's talking to the guy he's trying to pay for, and says, "Oh, let me give you this," and he puts his card down on the table, and his name is Wilson Golden, and he's the campaign manager for William Winter. Holy moly. Okay. Wilson Golden and I have been friends ever since. We're still friends today. Wilson now lives in Atlanta or out in Gainesville, Georgia, and we've been friends for years now. But there's these weird things begin to happen in this campaign. So anyway, we're off onto a lot of different types of stories here. So I don't know how much longer you want me to go.
Oh no, we could probably do this all day. But 1976 was that's a big Democratic field.
Right.
So when you get involved, is this one? It's just an interest of yours, vocationally. The Carters were family at this point.
Right.
Did you really think Jimmy Carter was going to win the nomination?
Well, we were all we'd all been drinking the Jimmy Carter Kool-Aid.
Unless you were all true,
true
true
We've been drinking
believers.
the Jimmy Carter Kool-Aid for 10 years at that point, 7 or 8, 9 years, and we just knew he had the right energy, he had the right personality. He was an engaging personality. He was a personality on issues you could get behind 100%. If there was something you disagreed with him on an issue, you'd kind of scratch your head and go, well, maybe I need to reevaluate my position. Maybe he's right.
Right.
And so you just kind of it became part of your your own personality to follow him, to believe in him and follow him around, and believe this was going to happen. And we were all talking about the movement, of what was going to happen in the South. Well, George Wallace was still in the campaign at that point, and was well known, and Jimmy Carter was not. So George Wallace was considered sort of the leading Southern candidate, and so the idea was, okay, if we're going to win, we've got to beat George Wallace in the South. We've got to beat George Wallace everywhere, but particularly in the South, so we can be seen as the Southern alternative.
Right.
The Southern alternative. And then, of course, all the great things happened in Iowa and New Hampshire. Oh my goodness! Wow, Jimmy Carter.
Then Florida's the real
Florida,
showdown.
Well, see, and this is what we began to do with our staff. The minute our Mississippi campaign was over, and we didn't win that caucus,
right?
Because George Wallace was still alive and strong.
Sure.
And that they were still dominated. That caucus was still dominated by those old white males in Mississippi who didn't know Jimmy Carter. Now,
Right.
we can come back and I can talk about a lot of anecdotes in that campaign and things that I did. We didn't have advanced people. We didn't have Secret Service, in the earliest part of that campaign. All kinds of wacky things happened. I would have to handle his schedule and do the advance work.
You really should write a book in your ample free time. You should write a book.
Okay, but but the details of that, or some of them are really funny, and some of them have just one or two. There was one of the first trips I was supposed to help manage was a trip to Alabama, to Birmingham, to Alabama, for Jimmy, and it was maybe it was September or October of that year of '75, and so they said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We got this lined up. He's got this editorial board meeting with the Birmingham News paper, blah blah. Okay, and he's got this event then at lunch and these other things, but we got to fill in a couple of gaps. Well, he's got some time early that morning, and so why don't we'll just have him come over to the dining hall at Birmingham Southern University of Alabama, Birmingham.
Okay.
University of Alabama, Birmingham.
UAB.
UAB. And we'll just go and get some of these students together to get around him for breakfast, and maybe we'll get some volunteers out of that. Okay. So he goes in there, sits down, he's having breakfast, and I'm grabbing some of these students, and I'm saying, hey, it's the former governor of Georgia over here, and he's running for president of the United States. You want to come over and have breakfast with him? No. So, no. I think we got maybe 2 students out of like 20 that I asked. They just going, nah, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't have time for that. And then we get into the elevator, and we're going to this editorial board meeting. And he said, he looked around the elevator, just me, and he said, do you have my brochures that I need for this, for this thing, or letters or something, to hand them? And I went,
Oh, no.
nobody told me about that. First time I'd ever done one. Nobody told me about that. I said that, something like that. And he got this real icy kind of look, and he had a tough side, that people don't see very often.
Sure.
And he said, so you asked them and they didn't tell you. And I went, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. So I mean, he was, I liked it that he wasn't cutting me any slack. He wasn't treating me like a kid. Okay. And so anyway, it worked out, and he had a very good editorial board meeting, and I found some materials and kind of pieced it together. But I was on pins and needles the rest of the day. Okay, so later in the day, we get to Montgomery. We're filling in the gap, and we're getting free TV time. We're doing whatever we can to get free time, And so we went into this TV show, and it was a kids show, and it was a guy who was doing the kids. It was like a puppet show and some other stuff where they're showing cartoons and stuff, And the guy used to be he was like a weatherman in Atlanta before that. I forgot his name. He'd been on the news somewhere in Atlanta. And so he said, okay, so we got in there and talked to the guy. Yeah, we'll let him come in there and talk to this guy during this kids show. Okay, anything to get on TV, anything to get free TV. And so they pulled me aside right before they sat down to do it and said, okay, well, the transition here is going to be at the end of this where we say, Governor, at the end of a long day of campaigning, what do you like to do? And we want him to say, I like to watch a cartoon. And I went, oh, man, you want me to go tell him that? You want me to go tell him that's what he's supposed to do? I went, oh, man, I'm already on pins and needles, okay, if that's what I got to do, okay. So I went and told him, and I kind of had it off to the side, and I said, here's what they want you to say. And he kind of smiled and said, okay, I'll do it. And he did. He did it just like that, What do you like to do at the end of a long day of campaigning, Governor? I like to watch a cartoon. And you rolled on, But anyway, I mean, those are kind of fun moments in a campaign. And of course, it exploded after that, and you had Secret Service and all that other stuff. And I got some really. I was lucky to be in some of the details of that, when that happened later.
So did you continue working on into the general election?
I did. Well, what happened is then we began to move staff around.
Sure.
The minute Mississippi was over, Hamilton was there that night, and Arkansas wasn't going to be till May. That primary wasn't going to be till May.
Right.
Louisiana wasn't going to be till April or May. Alabama wasn't till April, and so they said, "Okay, go to Oklahoma. That's the next caucus state, and it's also right before New Hampshire. Go to Oklahoma, and the guy in Oklahoma will tell you what to do." Well, that was great because my mother was from Oklahoma. So I get to Oklahoma. I got to handle her home county and all these other places, that were in northern Oklahoma. And we won. We beat Fred Harris.
Fred Harris.
Who was from Oklahoma. We beat him in Oklahoma.
The old progressive.
And Birch Bayh, his wife, was from Enid, Oklahoma.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And he was in the race, too, at the time. So we won that. And so then I got back in the car, was supposed to rush back to Atlanta, and drove back through Jackson, picked up some clothes and some other stuff. Went to Atlanta, and then I went to Virginia, and I handled Southwest Virginia, and so because of the way things work, so I had the whole panhandle of Southwest Virginia. Then I had
back when it was Democratic.
Right. Then I had the eastern half of North Carolina, and then wait a minute.
Okay.
I think I went from Oklahoma to Florida first. That's right. I went from Oklahoma to Florida. They gave me the middle part of Florida.
Whew.
And,
The I-4 corridor.
yeah, the I-4 corridor and all and north of Tampa, everything Newport Richey, everything north of Tampa, which was hot, growing, big.
Yeah.
And there's a picture I saw. It's in a gallery in Boston that I want to buy really badly, but it's a lot of money. It's like they want $1,500 from this picture. But it's a picture I never knew existed. It's a picture of me and Jimmy Carter in Florida on this campaign, and they have it mislabeled as North Carolina, but it's not. It's Florida. And and I'm wearing a tie. I got this wild, bushy, afro kind of hair, and Jimmy Carter's eating an ice cream cone, and talking to some guy on the sidewalk in this little town in northern Florida. It's a great picture, and I was able to capture it at least off the internet, and so I do have that. But it's a fun picture. So I did that part of and that's where I met Hunter Thompson for the first time. Spent time
Oh,
with
yeah,
him.
yeah.
Lots of fun Hunter Thompson stories, and he and my younger sister were big buddies. Then I went to North Carolina, to
Do
Virginia.
you
and
know
North Carolina.
everybody, Jim?
No, there are a lot of people I don't know that I really like to know.
Well, they're still out there.
I got to leave so I can go see some of them.
What time do you need to leave?
Well, I'm supposed to make a phone call at 11:15, and
Okay.
that's in 3 minutes. But I might be able to put that off.
What we'll do, we'll pause it. We'll pick up another time.
Okay,
I'm sure you and I we can sit down another time.
Sure.
So we'll call this end of part one.
Yeah, and I got some fun stories from that convention, of '76. I was Hamilton Jordan's assistant during that convention.
Well, that's where
Oh man, that whole story of getting to the convention and how I got there and drove up to Washington, got on the train.
Madison Square Garden and
Yeah, oh my God, and it was 1976. It was the bicentennial year, and
tall ships.
all these crazy stuff. Yeah, all these wild things happened. So that's a fun story.
Well,
That's a fun
that's
story.
where we'll pick up, Jim.
Okay, okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
On behalf of the Russell Library, and stay tuned for
Sure.
more.
You bet.